Well, welcome everyone to our Insider Speaker Series on preserving biodiversity. As I said, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so we can get the conversation started. We're very excited to have you here today. I am Emily Doyle, and I'm the Climate Resilience Program Manager at California State Parks Foundation. And we are a member-supported nonprofit dedicated to protecting and preserving California state parks. And this ranges from hosting volunteer events for members and the public, all the way to affecting change at the policy level. And at the base of this work is really to make sure that we educate both our members and the public about critical issues facing state parks. And that's why we started our Insider Speaker Series. And so as many of you know, excuse me, biodiversity is, the world is facing a big biodiversity crisis at the moment, and state parks and California is also being affected. So we're all here today to learn more about that important topic and the role that state parks can play. So to get started, I'll go over some logistics. Everyone is going to be muted throughout the webinar, but we will be using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to enter any questions you have, and we're going to be collecting those for a Q&A session at the end. And lastly, we just ask that everyone be respectful of our speakers and each other throughout the event. So now let me introduce our speakers. At our last webinar about climate change, we asked what people would be interested in learning about biodiversity. And it was about an even split between giant sequoias and statewide biodiversity initiatives. So we decided just to bring you both. So first, we're going to have Tim Borden, who is the Sequoia Restoration and Stewardship Manager for Save the Redwoods League. And he is the primary manager of the League's Sequoia restoration projects and works with California State Parks on the reintroduction of prescribed fire in sequoia groves in Calaveras Big Tree State Park. And then we have Annie Burke, who is the Executive Director of Together Bay Area, which is a coalition of local Native tribes, nonprofits, and other mission-aligned organizations in the Bay Area. And Annie also serves as the co-chair of California's 30 by 30 Partnership Coordinating Committee, which is a statewide initiative to conserve California's land and coastal waters for biodiversity and access purposes. So before we get to those talks, I'm just going to give a brief overview about what makes California such a special place, especially when it comes to biodiversity. So next slide, please. So California is the most biodiverse state in the country and is actually one of 36 designated biodiversity hotspots in the world. It's home to over 6,500 species of plants, more than 700 species of vertebrates, and over 30,000 species of insects. And in fact, 30% of all species in the United States are found in California, and many of these are endemic, which means they're not found anywhere else in the world. But this biodiversity is under threat. We've already seen a 20% decline in native species in California, and over 400 species are threatened or at risk of extinction. So how can parks help address this problem? Many of California's iconic species are actually found in state parks, and that includes, I think we're one slide too far, David, if you could go back. There we go, thank you. Yeah, so that includes every species you see in this image here. And so parks can play a key role in preserving the species that contribute to the tapestry of California's biodiversity. So let's look closer at what makes California so unique. California's biodiversity is due to its unique climate and geography, which you can see here. So the topographical map on the left shows the wide range of elevations across the state. And this ranges from below sea level at Death Valley in Southern California, all the way to peaks over 10,000 feet high in the Sierra Nevada. And the maps on the right, you can see the wide range in temperature and rainfall across the state, which is also highly variable. And these factors and more combine to come together and create California's unique climate, unique and diverse climate for sure. California is one of the few places in the world where the 5 major climate types occur in such close proximity. And these types include desert, cool interior, highland, steppe, and Mediterranean climates, which you can see all represented on this map. And because there are so many climate regions, California is home to many different habitats. And this diversity in habitats is reflected in state parks, which are found in every major ecoregion in the state. And this ranges from coastal redwoods state parks in the Mediterranean climate region on the northern coast to Milliken Lake State Park in the steppe climate region in the Central Valley, and down to Anza-Borrego Desert State Park in Southern California. And because of these many habitats, state parks are home to a wide array of species. And this includes, this includes the threatened Chinook salmon, bald eagles, and endangered peninsular bighorn sheep. I originally had a picture of the Johnny Cash tarantula on this slide, but I very quickly took that down. So you can see that state parks has an important role to play in preserving these many species that all contribute to California's biodiversity. And a major way that they do that is through large-scale ecosystem restoration projects that preserve the habitats where these species live. And one example of this is the Redwoods Rising project in Redwoods National and State Parks on the northern coast. And here, State Parks is working with national parks, Save the Redwoods League, and other partners to restore 70,000 acres of forest damaged by extensive logging. So this project is helping restore habitat for local wildlife, which includes the marble murrelet seabirds, and it's also helping to protect over half of the world's old-growth redwood trees. And these projects are also critical from a climate change perspective because healthy forests and healthy ecosystems are more resilient to climate disturbances, which means there's less of a chance of these important habitats disappearing. And you can see that it's not always looking at the individual species, but the greater picture of ecosystem health as a whole. So now that we've seen why California is such a biodiverse place and how parks can contribute, let's look more at why this biodiversity is under threat. And the primary cause of this is habitat loss. So in California, agriculture is a huge factor, as well as urban development, which is increasingly leading to habitat fragmentation, which is when large areas of habitat get broken up into smaller isolated areas that can limit species movement, and that decreases their chance of survival. So in addition to large-scale restoration projects, conserving large areas of uninterrupted habitat is also critical. And this is another place that state parks can play an important role. And one example of that is Chino Hill State Park in the Los Angeles area, which I've circled in black on this map. And you can see here that the park joins with other preserved lands in that area to create a wildlife corridor in a heavily developed area. So this really shows the importance of partnerships in terms of large-scale biodiversity conservation projects and how parks can work with surrounding land managers to really have a larger impact. And there's also another factor on top of all of this that we're going to have to start thinking about more and more as we go forward, which is climate change. So as I mentioned before, ecosystem restoration, healthy ecosystems are more resilient to climate change. But also, as temperatures warm, warmer temperatures and other impacts could actually cause habitats to shift. So species may need to move to new areas. And I think this illustrates that very well. Apologies for the poor resolution. This is the best image I could find. But this model shows how redwood habitat will actually move north to cooler areas based on temperature and precipitation models due to climate change. And it shows that by the end of the century, the iconic California redwood will actually be primarily in Oregon. So this, again, I think this image illustrates quite clearly that we're going to need to increasingly consider the effects of climate change when thinking about preserving habitat and biodiversity in California. So California recognizes the urgency of this crisis, and it has made preserving biodiversity one of the state's top priorities. So they've developed plans such as the Biodiversity Initiative, and most recently the 30 by 30 initiative, which Annie is going to talk about later. And we at California State Parks Foundation are also getting involved to protect one of California's iconic species, which I'm going to talk about a little later after our speaker presentations. But first, let's hear from our speakers. And first up is Tim, who's going to tell us more about giant sequoias. So take it away.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everybody, for joining and for being interested to hear about giant sequoia. That's not surprising to me that giant sequoia was what was requested. I have the chance to spend a lot of time in the giant sequoia range, and I meet people who come from all over the world many, many different parts of the world to come see these trees, because even though people may have never seen them in person before, they've heard about them. And there's this draw that people have. And to me, giant sequoia are something that you can't really appreciate until you see it in person, because it is something straight out of the imagination of Dr. Seuss. There's no other way that these things could exist. But they are different. Sometimes people conflate the two with coast redwoods. And so, next slide, David. I just wanted to just touch on that they are different than coast redwoods. Coast redwoods, of course, tend to be taller on average. The tallest trees on the planet are coast redwoods. Giant sequoia are not too far behind, but by volume, they tend to be bigger. And so the largest trees on the planet by volume are giant sequoia. One of the difference between giant sequoia and coast redwood you can see here is their needles. Their needles are very, very different. And even though they are different, they're a different family, or the same family rather, they are different genus and a different species. But they are both redwoods, and that if you were to see inside of a redwood, you would find a giant sequoia and coast redwood, you would find a really, really dark hued red color, which is just really characteristic of redwoods, of course. So go ahead, David, next slide, please. As I mentioned, they are the largest trees on the planet. The oldest verified sequoia is current that we know of is 3,200 years old. 3,200 years old. That means that's the Bronze Age happening in Europe and Asia and Africa. Those trees or some of these trees were around during that time period. It's just absolutely incredible to think about what they have seen. As far as carbon goes, they are the second largest above ground carbon storage of all landscapes, second, of course, only to coast redwood forests. And these groves have become very much biodiversity hotspots over the years. Next slide, please, David. A couple of these other characteristics. A giant sequoia that grows to be 3,200 years old produces billions of seeds over the lifespan of that tree. They tend to be among the fastest growing trees in the world. And some of the really specific characteristics of what they need in order to germinate, they require bare ground, they require lots of direct sunlight, and they also require the right fire conditions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next slide. They do grow in very distinct groves. There's 76 of them that are scattered throughout the Sierra Nevada, and giant sequoias are only naturally found in the Sierra Nevada. And most of them tend to be kind of grouped towards the very southern end of the Sierra Nevada in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and the surrounding Giant Sequoia National Monument, which is part of the U.S. Forest Service. And then, of course, I wanted to highlight towards the upper side of the map there, Calaveras Big Trees State Park, which we'll talk a little bit more about, where we have two giant sequoia groves that are very near and dear. These places, as I mentioned, can be biodiversity hotspots, not only for animals, but for some other species of plants. Example would be sugar pines. Some of the largest and tallest sugar pines that we've ever found have been growing alongside giant sequoias in several different groves. But we also have some really critical species of animals, next please, including the California spotted owl. And these are some photos that we have captured in the last couple of years here of us in California spotted owls, which of course are listed as endangered and a really critical species for us to be concerned with giant sequoia grows, because we want to protect that habitat and make sure that these things recover and are here for a long time, just because they are so dang cute. And very critical species too. On the right side there, that is an adult spotted owl, and on the left side, that is a fledgling spotted owl within its first year. Next slide, please. Some other key species of concern that we find a lot in these groves. Black bear, of course, not endangered by any means, but definitely really prefer these habitats. It's right within their right within their wheelhouse of places that they like to spend a lot of time in. We also have the mountain yellow-legged frog as a species of concern that we find in some wetter areas of groves, along with its cousin foothill yellow-legged frog, and both of those are also listed as endangered. Next slide, please. Back to the owl fledgling, just some more pictures, because we can never have enough baby pictures of spotted owls. Just too good. Next slide, please. Here's something that we may have heard of over the summer. The discovery of a gray wolf pack in Tulare County, around where the giant sequoia groves on Giant Sequoia National Monument are. And these two photos right here are the first photos that we had captured of gray wolves down here in Tulare County. So but they are in fact confirmed by California Division of Fish and Wildlife to be a gray wolf in California. And we now know that we have at least 5 of these gray wolves down in Tulare County. When I first saw this picture, I thought it was my husky. It's really close resemblance, but it's not. It's actually a gray wolf, which is so exciting that they're hanging around groves now and appear to be doing quite well. Next slide. Just one more fledgling picture. It's, again, too good. Too good to be true. Too good to see in person. And then next picture, please. And then the last species of concern that I want to just mention is the Pacific fisher. Pacific fisher is also listed as endangered. There are about 3,000 of these left in California and about 400 of them estimated to be left in the Sierra Nevada. So huge species of concern for us. This is a spotted owl, Pacific fisher that we captured on a game camera in one of the groves that we spend a lot of time in. And Pacific fisher have been their habitat has been decimated in the last couple of years. They've lost habitat previously due to things like logging and people moving deeper into the forest. But specifically in the last couple of years, they've been losing their habitat to high severity wildfire. And so it's animals like the Pacific fisher that we're really concerned about moving forward with our sequoia groves and making sure that they've got that habitat that they need so that we have them around. Next slide, please. There's some big changes that you may have heard are happening in giant sequoia grove. Going back a long time now, a century and a half ago, it started with Euro-American colonization. People from back east or other European descendants, people coming into California, coming into the Sierra Nevada, and that resulted in several different things. It resulted in removal of indigenous stewardship from our landscapes. It removed cultural burning that our indigenous communities did in these landscapes. It led to the suppression of wildfires that started naturally. It led to changes in land use, such as an increase in logging in a lot of cases, the introduction of grazing, and as well as visitation to these trees. On the right side there of the screen, that's the pioneer cabin tree at Calaveras Big Tree State Park, which fell a couple of years ago. Very big popular tourist destination. And it was carved so that you could drive or walk underneath it, which of course weakens the tree and eventually falling. And so all these kinds of changes. And then all of that, and you put on top of it all of the complexity that climate change brings, a hotter, drier climate, more erratic weather patterns. And that's going to lead to the crisis that we're kind of seeing. And one of the other things that I want to really highlight, if you go to the next picture, please. This is a photo of the Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park in 1890. And you can see the park-like atmosphere in it. This is shortly after the Buffalo Soldiers took over management and supervision of the grove and started to become a tourist attraction. Next slide, please. This is the same location in 1970. And so the difference between these 80 years and what happened is largely fire suppression, either by natural ignitions or, again, the removal of cultural burning from indigenous communities. What that did was removed all these instances of fire that would have naturally occurred in these groves, and it allowed for this increase in this growth of these shade-tolerant species of trees. The tree that you see here that's really taken up a lot of space is not sequoia, it's not pine, it's mostly driven by white fir. And white fir is a tree that would have been kept in check by these repeated instances of fire that would have happened in this period of 80 years. But unfortunately, it didn't. It's right around this time period that Mariposa Grove, we started to have this reintroduction of wildfire take place, prescribed fire. That's led to the conditions that Mariposa is in today, where it can do very well when it comes through to fire. Next slide, please. So I said we're in a giant crisis. There is no previous significant record of mortality of these trees dying by fire. There's bits and pieces here and there over the last couple of centuries that we've seen in the paleodendrology record, but we don't see large mortality by fire. We started seeing that in 2015 and 2017, especially coming out of the drought years, and during the drought years, the climate change driven drought years, where we started to see some interesting mortality. And then in 2020 and 2021 fire seasons, between 3 fires, we saw catastrophic mortality among these old, thousands of year old giant sequoias that led to the loss of an estimated 14 to 19% of all mature giant sequoia on the planet, full stop. That is a crisis. And next slide, please. This is the areas where those fires have occurred, these 5 fires since 2015, just to get a good idea of where they're burning. And the dark red in there is all giant sequoia growth. Next slide, please. So we have a giant task ahead of us, right? Emily mentioned earlier, what do we need to do to our forests in order to protect the biodiversity that we have, in order to protect the carbon stocks that these forests have, that we desperately need to be healthy. Managing forests for overall forest health and resiliency is the way to do that. We have a really high degree of confidence that that is what needs to happen. And there's several ways to do that, and every grove is in a different condition, and every grove requires something different to be able to put it on that pathway. A lot of the time it looks like burning. A lot of the time it looks like prescribed fire. It looks like reconciliation forestry practices by the select removal of trees here and there, creating the conditions where we can then safely reintroduce fire. And then finally, the ultimate goal is to recalibrate these groves to a historical fire regime. These groves, depending on elevation, burned anywhere between 7 to 25 years. Every 7 to 25 years, we need to return to that kind of cycle. And if we do that, we can make sure these groves are here for a while. Next slide, please. So focusing back on Calaveras Big Tree State Park, one of my favorite places. Of course, Calaveras is famous for being the area where giant sequoias were discovered by Euro-American colonizers. It's the first place where people started visiting these groves. There's 2 distinct groves at Calaveras Big Trees, the North and South Grove. And of course, with Save the Redwoods League, this is a park that's near and dear to my heart, to our heart, because in 1931, Save the Redwoods League helped take Calaveras Big Tree State Park, which was a privately owned park at the time and had been for decades, and helped it become part of the state park system. And we expanded the park as well in 1954. Next slide, please. So given all of the crisis around the fires that we've seen, there's this newfound energy, this newfound need to make sure that we stem the tide of the loss that we're seeing from giant sequoia range, to make sure that we stem the tide of the loss that we're seeing of habitat for spotted owl, for Pacific fisher, for yellow-legged frog, all these species of concern. So what is Calaveras doing, and what is Save the Redwoods League working with Calaveras on doing? Well, first off, in 2021, we founded the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition with our partners at the Forest Service and National Park Service and state parks and so many other tribal and local and federal and state organizations. California State Parks has been working to expand their fire management staff to be able to have more prescribed fire going on in giant sequoia groves, including in Calaveras. Calaveras has entered these brand new partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service and Cal Fire and the National Park Service, so that when we do reintroduce fire, as we have been the last couple of years, we have the support to be able to get it done. And we've seen this now through multiple years of reintroducing fire in the North Grove and the surrounding area with some pretty good successes. This picture on the right you see is just from not too long ago in the North Grove, in the heart of the North Grove. And you've got a trail just to the right there. You see the hose that's on the ground. This is us getting ready to put fire on the ground just a few days after this. So that involves protecting some of these giant sequoias so that there's not too much fuel around them underneath to be able to allow too much heat into the tree. We want some heat, but not too much. And of course, there's a hose there on the ground. We like to run hoses where we can to be able to cool things down if we need to. And so there's a lot of prep work that goes into this. And of course, very, very famously, if you're following Calaveras Big Trees, we're working towards the reintroduction of fire in the South Grove at Calaveras Big Trees, which does not have a very extensive history of burning in a very, very long time. Next slide, please. Of course, there are big challenges to this. Working to helping the public learn and acknowledge the long history of management through fire before Euro-American colonization. Again, that's recognizing that stopping fires from burning in these groves have led to significant changes that is having this crisis of epic proportions where we're losing these trees and we're losing this habitat and we're losing this carbon. We need to be okay with using tools to restart fire management. Tools like fire, tools like chainsaws in some cases. Anything that we can do that's the appropriate tool to be able to recalibrate to the natural fire regime. We've got to understand that fire and forest restoration work can be ugly. Burned landscapes, we've been conditioned over the years to look at a burned landscape and go, oh my God, what happened? This is a disaster. And in some cases it is, where we have high mortality. But sometimes when you use prescribed fire, you get scorch marks, you get trees that die, you get all these kinds of effects that happen and are intended to happen sometimes. And all of this is part of the process, and we need to learn to recognize that it is a healthy thing in a lot of cases. Resources are still severely limited, though, to be able to take advantage of the windows. Forest carbon, when we talk about the amount of carbon these forests sequester, yes, there is a release of carbon that occurs when you burn, whether it's through pile burning or through broadcast burning. That's totally true. But when you play out the scenario 5, 10, 20 years down the road, you have that initial release of carbon, but again, a healthy forest that you get by burning down the road, if you play it out, is going to take up more carbon. And that is what we're focused on doing. There's that initial release, but it more than makes up for the difference in the long term. And of course, we need to recognize that fire cannot be replicated, especially in giant sequoia growth. Next slide, please. So we've got a big future ahead of us. Land managers, politicians, the public are more motivated than ever by the events that we've seen in the last couple of years to get this done. We have more research than ever to influence and guide our decisions, and we're continuing to learn every year. We have a very high degree of confidence that what we're doing and what we're working towards is being successful. We have plenty of success stories to inspire us, such as the giant forests in Sequoia National Park, where when it burned in the KMP complex fire in 2021, its long history of prescribed fire meant that the fire that burned through there did a lot of good. We didn't lose trees. We saw the same thing happen at Mariposa Grove in Yosemite last year. So we have successes to point to that show what it is, that give us that blueprint. And ultimately, it comes down to we need to decide if we want giant sequoia. And if we do, then our work is cut out for us, but we know what to do and we can do it. And next slide, please. And that's going to do it for giant sequoia. And I'm so glad to be able to take some questions and learn more from you guys and be able to talk about this more when we're done. But thanks for caring about these trees and caring about the fisher and caring about the owl and everything else that I care about too.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tim. Those historic pictures of the Mariposa Grove are just really stunning to see the impact that we've had on our natural landscapes. So I'm looking forward to hearing more in the Q&A. But now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Annie Burke. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Tim, for a great presentation about the work that you and Save the Redwoods League and so many of your partners are doing. I especially want to thank you for the multiple photos of the spotted owl. All presentations should include some spotted owl photos, so thank you. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about 30 by 30 and how it relates to parks and how it relates to biodiversity. I watched everyone come in and introduce themselves in the chat, and I just see so many people here today that care deeply about this place, the state, lots of different specific places here in this event, but there's a lot of people who really care deeply, and I just thank you for caring deeply and for being here today. Next slide. As Emily said, I'm Annie Burke. I am born and raised in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, and I am the executive director of Together Bay Area, as well as the co-chair of California's 30 by 30 Partnership Coordination Committee. I'm also a mom and a sister and a daughter and a friend and a partner and lots of other things. That's my mom on the right and her best friend putting their feet in the Stanislaus River. And I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for those two women. They give me a lot, including what we refer to as Rachel Carson's sense of wonder. And I just want to start by saying that sharing my acknowledgement, my love for those two people and how they brought me here today. Next slide. I also want to acknowledge that we're all here, wherever you are, standing on Indigenous lands. Every inch of land is Indigenous land. If you don't know who if you don't know the local tribe for where you are, I encourage you to find out. But I want to move beyond just acknowledging the land. I also want to celebrate some of the work that's happening. Last year, the partnership, the MOU that was signed between California State Parks and the Yurok tribe was really historic. And I think we should, I feel very proud of this state and the state leadership for that work. And that partnership and that relationship that's being formed and constantly being deepened and broadened. Also want to celebrate land that's being returned around the state. On the right there, you see a picture of the event where 5 acres were returned to the Confederated Villages of Lejeune from the city of Oakland. And that was a really important, while the acreage isn't big, the importance of it, the meaning of it is really huge. So there's a lot more that we need to do in California and beyond. And there's a lot of work that's happening that's worth celebrating. Next slide. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about Together Bay Area. Together Bay Area is a regional coalition of a bunch of different kinds of organizations, nonprofits, public agencies, local Native American tribes and businesses, all working together for climate resilience and social equity. We're in the 9 counties of the Bay Area and Santa Cruz County, so that we call it the 10 counties. We always have to explain that Santa Cruz Park, because those mountain lions don't know the difference between Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties. We work on a bunch of different things, which I'll tell you about in a second. Next slide. Our members are really on the ground implementers. They're doers with programs and projects that make a tangible impact on the lands, watersheds, and communities. And I encourage you to go check out who these organizations are. because they're really doing amazing work in big and small ways with their communities. Next slide. Some of the things that we're doing at Together Bay Area, these are our 4 priorities, and these are our North Stars. We, as a coalition of 70+ organizations, and the small organization that coordinates, are really working for a few things. One is conserving 50% of the 10 counties by 2050. And I encourage you to learn more about that. Currently, we're around 30%, and each county is at different levels depending on the conservation actions that have been taking place there. And we lead a program called the Conservation Lands Network, which identifies the lands essential for biodiversity and set regional habitat goals. So that's one way that we're moving forward that priority. Second is around building capacity for Native American tribes and tribal alliances. We have a program called Right Relations, where Together Bay Area members participate in a 9-month cohort-based program to learn, take action, and build community around that. Third is that we do a lot of advocacy for public funding. We are big fans and supporters of the State Coastal Conservancy, and especially their Bay program, their Explore the Coast program, Restoration Authority, and other programs that have brought, I don't know what the latest number is, but hundreds of millions, maybe in the billions of dollars to local work. And the State Coastal Conservancy just does really, really important work. In the Bay Area, you can't drive 20, 30 minutes anywhere in any direction without seeing some of the impact of their funding and their technical assistance. And fourth, we work to build a social network of practitioners and professionals. We're not going to solve these problems by ourselves. We need to solve them together. And part of resilience and part of transforming how we live together on this planet requires us working together. So those are just some of the things that we're doing at Together Bay Area. Now I want to turn the attention to 30 by 30. 30 by 30 is a global movement to conserve 30% of land and coastal waters by 2030. If you're interested in more of the science and the background of that, I encourage you to look up E.O. Wilson's book, Half Earth, which talks about 50%. There's a lot more to say. What I'd like to be doing, though, is watch a short video. So next slide, and let's hit play. It might take a second for the technology to catch up with us. And when it does, we'll go.
Our relationship with the natural world is out of balance. We are burning the library of life.
1 million species could go extinct in the next decades if we do not act. But this isn't just about species.
The ecosystems we rely on for our water, our air, and our food are also at risk of collapse.
Our survival depends on nature's survival. And scientists say we must act boldly and urgently.
That is why the United Arab Emirates,
Nigeria, the United Kingdom,
Costa Rica,
France has joined forces with many countries across the world to form the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People.
Together, we're championing a global deal to safeguard our planet and ourselves. We are committed to conserving at least 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030.
this ambitious but achievable global goal can help us address the most important interdependence crisis: biodiversity collapse, the climate crisis, and the emergence of pandemics.
And this goal will also strengthen our economies and livelihoods through creating jobs.
It is time to take bold action to face this planetary emergency.
To heed the wisdom of our indigenous peoples and local communities as protectors of the most biodiverse sites in the world.
De proteger os nossos sistemas de suporte de vida e de nos tornarmos em ancestrais responsáveis para as futuras gerações.
But we cannot achieve this alone.
We call on all nations to join us in the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People to commit to protecting at least 30% of our land and ocean by 2030.
And to advocate for this goal before the world meets to agree on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework under the Convention of Biological Diversity.
Let's heal our relationship with the earth.
Let's act now.
Thank you. Next slide, please. I'm very proud to say that California signed on to that, along with many other countries, and we are moving forward here in this great state. October 7th, 2020, our governor signed the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, which set a commitment to conserve 30 by 30. And then just this past October 7th, SB 337 by Senator Min codified it into law. So this goal is now part of state law, and we are working towards it. Next slide. Over some thousands of people, I'm not sure the exact number, provided input into how we're going to do it, how we're going to get to 30% by 2030. And in April 2022, the Pathways to 30 by 30 document was released, and I want to give some credit to Secretary Crowfoot, as well as Dr. Norris and Madeline Drake and many others who were part of this really complicated and exciting process to figure out how we're going to do this as a state. Next slide. There are three key objectives to 30 by 30 in California. One's around biodiversity, one's around expanding access to nature, and the other is around mitigating and building resilience to climate change. Next slide. We know that to do those, we need to also make some core commitments. One is around justice, equity, and inclusion. Another is around strengthening tribal partnerships, and we see that throughout the initiative, and also around economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and food supply. Like the idea of conserving lands does not happen in silos. It happens in a multidimensional, multi-benefit way. So these core commitments highlight that. Next slide. Really key to 30 by 30 is the definition of what conserved means. And this is the official definition for the state of California. I want to note that there are different kinds of definitions that are used in this state and across the world, depending on the location and the goals and the land tenure and the situation on the ground. What was really key about this is that it's durably protected and managed. So I encourage you to go check out the Pathways document if you'd like to learn more about what that definition means and how it's come about. Okay, I bet you're curious about where we are today. So next slide, please. We have so far conserved the latest numbers around 24% of lands and 16% of coastal waters. That means we have about 5.5 million acres more to conserve in the next 6 years. A great resource in California, Green Info Network, is collecting data on what counts towards that acreage. I mean, there's all kinds of efforts that are happening, both in terms of the actual conservation, but also lots of work around the act of conservation. So that's stewardship, that's partnering with communities, that's partnering with tribes, that's all kinds of different restoration efforts, that kind of thing. Next slide. I'm going to admit that I'm a lands person, not a waters person. I appreciate the water. I love going to the beach, but it's not my area of expertise. But here's a little bit more information about it. There's a lot of work happening. The Ocean Protection Council, as well as the State Coastal Conservancy, are doing a lot of really important work in terms of conserving those coastal waters. And I hope that you'll invite another speaker, perhaps Jen Eckerly, to come join you to talk more about that. I'm going to skip right over it very respectfully. Next slide, please. There's 10 pathways, and there's a lot of text on the screen. I want to get to what's next, but I want you to know that there's a lot of different ways, 10 ways that we're really moving towards achieving this goal. The first one, accelerating regionally led conservation, is of course my favorite. Next slide. There's a lot of people involved in 30 by 30. And it's really incumbent on all of us, whether you're directly involved in conserving land or not. If you're somebody who cares deeply about the place that you live, you're also can be involved, and I'll give you some tangible ways to do that in just a second. But I want you to know that there's a lot of coordination that's happening, and that's the takeaway from this slide. Next slide. I haven't met a perfect person yet, and I haven't met a perfect initiative yet. There's some tensions within the 30 by 30 initiative that we're managing. They're not problems we're solving, they're tensions that we're managing. And I just want to say that it's a very simple thing. There's two numbers, 30 and 2030, but it's incredibly complex about how we implement it. The difference between perfect and good enough, moving us forward bites the apple so that we keep moving moving forward and doing good progress is really important. How 30 by 30 interacts at different scales is really different. We also need to hurry up. The crises that we're facing are real, and we need to take action. We also need to slow down and build the relationships and build the trust in order to have durable impact. And there's a difference between what is counted and what matters. That's a whole other topic for another day. There's a bunch of reasons why 30 by 30 is a good thing and why 30 by 30 gives me hope. And I want to share a few of them with you. Next slide. California Native Americans are involved, and they're gaining power and resources. They're being connected into existing efforts. They're creating new efforts. And to me, that gives me a ton of hope. That's key, not just for environmental justice, for social justice, but also for climate resilience. We also have a common language. 30 by 30 allows me to talk to my colleagues up and down the state about something that otherwise might take us a while to get to figure out, to find the words. And that, I think, can really move us farther, faster. Next slide. Building on something Tim said earlier, we know what we need to do. Like, let's take action. Let's move this. We know we have a goal. And we know what we need to do. So that is, I think, a huge, I find that really empowering. We also have a lot of opportunities to build relationships and partnerships. Collaboration is so key, and I think 30 by 30 is a way to do that. And next slide. And the last thing that gives me hope and why I think 30 by 30 is a good thing is that it's a tailwind, not a headwind. Natural resources, parks have been underinvested and undervalued for decades and decades. And now there's an opportunity to invest in them. And this tailwind from the governor to the Secretary of Natural Resources down to the legislature really is a tailwind that we should take advantage of. Last slide, or next slide. Lastly, the thing here's, oh, not that slide, one before that one. Oh, there's a slide missing about what you can do. So I'm just going to tell it to you. There's a few things you can do. I encourage you to go to the California Natural Resources website and subscribe to the 30 by 30 newsletter. There's lots of information that's sent out in that newsletter. And I hope that you'll plug into that and attend their webinars, attend their events, learn more. Support land conservation. That's the formation of new national monuments, new parks, voluntary acquisitions across the state. Of course, support your local state park in whatever ways however that means to you. Do your part to help restore and steward the land, and work to connect people to nature, which based on what I saw in the chat in the introductions, everybody here is already doing. So with that, thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Annie. That was great. It's really interesting to see all the partnerships that are really essential to go into this, and how parks are really kind of just a piece of this puzzle. So we're going to move on quickly to Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time, but we've been looking at collecting your questions as we go along. So I have one for Tim, which is, how do you address biodiversity below ground in terms of pre and post wildfire and prescribed burn efforts?
I'm curious to know what you mean by below ground biodiversity, because I think of a couple different things. If that person wants to maybe expand on that, and maybe we can move on to something and then come back to it.
Sure.
Or
sure. Let's see. Bear with me. I'm sorry. These are still coming in. What about the role between, you mentioned carbon sequestration balanced with prescribed burns. Can you talk a little bit about, a little more about the relationship between those in terms of like replanting trees? I know you said that they're the fastest growing, so that could have a big impact in terms of increasing sequestration that way. And if there's any other use perhaps of any of the biomass that you remove through fuel reduction instead of burning. I think I've heard of people using it for other economic purposes. I'm not sure if you're aware of any of that, but those two topics would be interesting.
Oh yeah, we definitely use whatever we can remove if possible, but there's pretty big limitations to that. And we're not making money off of these projects when we remove material. We're still spending a lot of money to be able to do it, and we're just using the revenues from that to offset our costs. But when we do have the possibility to remove timber and to take it down to the sawmill, we do that, because the alternative to that is burning right on site, which so remove material, we have too much material that we don't want to burn. And so that's a really good option to do it. We also sometimes take things down to biomass plants where it gets burned and turned into energy. Sometimes we take material places where it's chipped and sent to playgrounds or your front yard when you mulch your front yard. These things are all, we sometimes use these things, but they are all incredibly expensive. And but sometimes that makes more sense than just pile burning material. When it comes to let's say that first thing again that you said, Emily, the first part of that question. I want to make sure
kind of the balance between regrowth and replanting of sequoias post-fire and the increased carbon sequestration from that.
Yes, thank you. Well, we don't always need to replant after prescribed fire. Ideally we don't need to, because we would have gotten the kind of fire that's going to initiate the kind of natural regrowth that we want. But we are seeing with high severity fire, in some cases, we're not getting natural regeneration from sequoia to the levels that we would have expected. We are seeing it. We're seeing pockets of it here and there, but it is pretty patchy. And so there are efforts in some cases where we're seeing regeneration failure, where we're going back in and planting sequoia and pine and cedar and even white fir, even though I mentioned that white fir is a big contributor to how we got here, and that there's so much growth of white fir. And I think some of this might seem counterintuitive, right? We talk about trees as a vehicle for sequestering carbon, and planting more and more and more. And it might seem counterintuitive for us to want to remove trees from a forest or kill trees by fire. But there's a carrying capacity to our forest, right? We can only have so many trees per acre, and just simply having more is not better. Just like the other side of it, we don't want too little. There's a window, and we want to stay within that window, because that's what's going to keep the forest healthy. And so, yeah, if we burn, if we replant in these areas where we've seen high severity fire and natural regeneration failure, we're going to create those kind of forest conditions that are going to give us the most possible carbon sequestration that we can get.
Okay, great. Thanks for that extra information. And then Annie, we have time for one more quick one for you. So someone's asking, can you talk a bit about what counts toward conserved lands in terms of how much public access, limits on activities and land use, such as dogs, for example?
It's a great question, and something that's been discussed. A whole lot of oxygen has been used to discuss just that very question. So you went straight to the heart of what a lot of people have been working on and talking about. Because of time, I'm just going to give a very short answer, and that is that the state decided to use a definition of conservation that ties into a federal measurement system that's called gap codes. That's all I'm going to say about gap codes, and I'm going to point you to the Pathways to 30 by 30 document, which explains it in much more detail than I'm able to quickly right now. The importance of that is that there is a pretty clear definition that's really targeted for biodiversity, and we acknowledge that that is one way to look at land conservation and how it's conserved. So it's trying to thread a needle about simplicity and clarity, while addressing the complexities of dynamic living systems, which is what we're working to conserve.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. And now I just want to touch, again, I know we're short on time, just touch very briefly on some work that we're doing. As I mentioned, one of the focus programs here at California State Parks Foundation is to help protect the Western monarch butterfly, which is really iconic in California since so much of its overwintering habitat is in state parks. So we can have a lot of impact in this area. And we don't have time to go into too much more detail, but feel free to go to our website and you can read more about the work that we're doing, which includes grant programs, volunteer days, and different events like that. So we're just going to go ahead and close up. So again, thank you for attending the Insider Speaker Series. We're going to put a poll up so we can hear from you what topics you will be interested in learning next. We're having a webinar on park access and inclusion early next year. So it'd be great if you could take a second to answer that. I believe that should be going up shortly. And also just to let you know about a couple interesting things coming up. The Thanksgiving Western monarch count is currently underway, and the New Year's one will begin next month. And this is the annual year-end counts that that track the statewide population of monarchs. So we're going to be getting some updated numbers so we can see how that's how the population is doing. And we're going to put a link in the chat if you want to keep an eye on that or perhaps get involved. And also, if you want to help us continue our work supporting the Western monarch butterfly, please donate to our Giving Tuesday campaign. I believe that link will also be going up in the chat. And again, thank you for coming. I really hope you enjoyed the webinar. We're going to be sending out the recording shortly, as well as a survey. We appreciate any feedback you can provide to help us continue to refine these events as we go forward. We want to make sure that you get the most out of it as possible. And we're also going to answer some of the questions that we didn't get to, so you can look forward to that. And here are our social media handles. So if you want to continue to keep up and learn more about what we're doing, feel free to check it out and follow us. And I believe that's about it. So just thank you again. Your support really makes our work possible. And we hope to see you at events in the future. So have a great afternoon. And thank you again to the speakers. It was great.